All right, ladies and gentlemen, please find a seat, and you can also move forward because we are not obviously filling all this lecture hall. But dear friends and colleagues, it's almost a shame to invite you here indoors and underground when finally the sun and summer has reached also Northern Europe and Helsinki, and of course we all have a right to enjoy that fantastic feeling that it's warm outdoors. But this kind of a situation for a think tank such as Kalevi Sorsa Foundation provides always also a problem. We are delighted to invite and bring international guests to Helsinki. Then the city is at its best, like today. On the other hand, our potential audience has to choose there to sit inside in another seminar or to enjoy the warm spring. After a long and dark and cold winter, it is not such an easy choice, but I think there is still time for a few seminars before the holiday season in Finland really starts. So thank you all for coming to share this afternoon with us, devoting your precious time to our afternoon session. I wish you all very warmly welcome. Kalevi Sorsa Foundation is delighted to continue its cooperation with our European fellows that form an intellectual network across the continent around the Brussels-based think tank Foundation for European Progressive Studies, FEPS. Today, our theme, our topic, we are focusing on feminist approaches to economic policy. I think that nowadays it's pretty hard to imagine anybody who claims to be a progressive not being one kind of a feminist or another. Still, the claim remains all too often just a slogan. In order to gain credibility, we do have to take steps further and ask, what does feminism mean in different policy areas? How do we recognize the gender perspective, and what kind of action it requires us to take? We already have some ground rules that in all the reforms and policy initiatives, the government, the city councils, the companies, and so forth, they should evaluate the ethical consequences of those policies they are making and leading. For example, the ecological impact for the environment. I think this applies in principle also to gender issues and perspectives, but all too often just in principle. I think that this is especially true when we consider the hard truths of economics and economic policy that are still heavily gender biased and male-dominated fields, at least in Finland. The past 10 years of European financial crises provide a telling example. There has been very few commentaries and commentaries that analyze the past austerity measures and their consequences in terms of gender, or if there has been, they easily fall into the marginal. And yet we know the well-functioning welfare state is the best ally for women, both in terms of services as well as jobs. Public sector is a major employer for women. So I'm very interested to hear what kind of inputs we will hear during our afternoon together. But before we proceed to the lectures, I will invite our Slovenian guest, Mia Javornik, to take the floor and to give her introductory remarks. Ms. Javornik is a member of the executive of the Party of European Socialist Women, and the rest you can tell yourself. Thank you. Please take the floor.
The second part that you wanted to say is that I'm also a program manager at the Central Eastern European Network for Gender Issues, but I'm hereby representing FEPS, or PACE Women as it was said. So let me just say hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you today in Helsinki. And let me start by thanking Kalevi Sorsa and FEPS for organizing this important event. And of course, thanks to all of you that have taken the time to be here today. Standing here in front of you today is particularly hard. Hard because I had to stand in big shoes. Shoes of one of my mentors, Zita Gurmey, who along and with others fought for the rights we, women and other vulnerable groups have today. Rights that have been fought by progressive social democrats who were at the forefront of setting the cornerstones of our modern democratic societies. We, or I, social democrat, were the ones who came up, our predecessors, with and implement 8 hours working day, public childcare, strong public education and healthcare system, pension benefits, parental leave regulation with high income replacement, job security and unemployment insurance, and general progressive taxation. Major features of our women's indivisible human rights, or by using Pace Women's words, my body, my rights. Rights that a lot of people today have taken for granted. Rights that my generation is slowly losing. As a young woman with almost 10 years of working experience and political involvement, I dare to say, we are done, we have to end with business as usual. At the heart of the debate today should be how we can strengthen enlightened and democratic societies. We have seen a lot of analysis on the recent financial and economic crisis, concentrating on its causes and also on the direct consequences. But I firmly believe that we, progressive, or this conference, aims higher. The analysis is not a problem. The challenge is how to forge a solution. We are facing a crisis of epic proportions. More than 65 million people have fled their homes, which is more than any time after the Second World War. Among them are more than 21 million refugees. And after the financial crisis, we are in the situation in which smugglers are targeting women who are traveling alone. They are also targeting accompanied minors. In Save the Children report in 2016, 7,900 accompanied minors came to Europe this year, which represented 15% in total. I do believe that the times of the crisis are also the times of change, or as Wallerstein put it so well, when humans can really shape their history by political and social engagement. But the direction of change will depend from political forces who will take the initiative in political battles for the hearts and the mind of the majority of the people. This is the prime time for us progressives to reframe our values. Times in which we have to stop acting as a discounted populist right. Times when we are first to realize that to the day, and I quote, parental leave scheme has kept maternity designation, failing to spur significant substitution effect, fathers observing childcare while mothers return to work earlier. Neither the state nor companies have systematically encouraged fathers to share childcare, with the majority of parents and managers still citing the perception that fathers taking longer parental leave is frowned upon or career limiting. End of quote. This is the test of our capacity for collective action. The conservative backlash dissolves the fabric of the society, but at the same time fails to protect vulnerable groups. While substantive effort has been placed on changing legislation, introducing gender machineries and ombudsmen and ombudswomen, we do not have to go far to see a live web stream propaganda against abortion on the wall of the church in the country that I'm coming from, Slovenia. Concerns with regard to women's position in the labor force has emerged, and new patterns of employment discrimination common to open economies occurred. The service sector became further gender segregated. While public service sector became central employer of women, opportunities abound for men in private financial sectors. To illustrate, UNICEF found evidence of gender-biased recruitment among private employers, largely due to the perception that female employment involves higher non-wage costs because of their family responsibilities, earlier retirement benefits, and the regulation preventing pregnant women from night work and from work longer hours. Companies allegedly required women, as a condition of their employment, to sign undated contracts stating that upon pregnancy they would quit their job. Neoliberal infection of the progressive parties before and during economic and financial crisis also impacted the political space. Especially the credibility of our parties to confront the negative trends and protect the voters from them. To conclude, looking around the Central Eastern European region, looking around the world, our modern democratic societies are at the crossroads. Even though throughout history political battles were fought in the fields of class and gender, nowadays one cannot talk anymore about the indivisible human rights. Indivisible human rights have become shrunken to identity rights by the center-right, even prior to the economic and financial crisis in 2008. But in times of crisis, political leaders started to question even these identity rights. Rights of migrants and refugees, especially women, minority groups, sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I would argue that each step away from indivisible human rights is presented a step forward towards tolerating conflicts around the world, towards increased social differences, and towards minimizing social impact, social power of social democracies. As said, not only from the left, but our society as a whole, we are at the crossroads, on the path, on the road, on which social democrats, progressive, should start setting up a common, social, democratic, European economic and social policies. Sorry to say, but there is none. Social models need to be updated. They have to be transformed into a concept of, let's say, and dare to say, social citizenship. It is not only fair, but it is democratic, because my future is also your future. And if not, I fear that the torch that has been passed from the social democratic predecessors to us will have to start a whole new journey all over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Miha, and please, our best regards to Chita as well. When you are in contact with her, we hope to see her in Helsinki in another occasion. But now let's move forward, and I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Özlem Onaran. She's a professor of economics and director of Greenwich Political Economy Research Center at the University of Greenwich. In her research, Professor Onaran has dealt with such issues as inequality, wage-led growth, employment, globalization, gender, and crises. She has directed research projects, among others, for the International Labour Organization, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Today, her topic is the impact of gender equality and gender-aware economic policy on growth and development. Please, the floor is yours.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also very happy to speak at a conference that is explicitly titled Feminist Approaches to Economic Policy, without being apologetic about it. So this is, I think, an achievement women's movement has achieved so far. What I will try to do today is to give some ammunition about the positive impact gender equality can have on some other aims that we have in terms of having a sustainable and equitable society without instrumentalizing it, But I think it is very important that beyond the moral reasons for which we do stand behind gender equality, there are also reasons that all politicians have to embrace. So I'll try to focus on these. And let me first start with the pessimistic note about the state of economic policy making. Sadly, still very much marked by austerity in Europe. And the track record of austerity is very clear. It has failed. Despite this track record, in Europe, fiscal conservatism still prevails. This has brought us high unemployment rates in parts of Europe, or in other parts where unemployment rates are slowly returning back to the levels before the Great Recession. The success is far from clear. We have low and precarious jobs, increasingly relying on low-skilled workers, and in most cases failing to make full use of the full capacity of our talented young people. The gaps in social standards persist within countries and across regions and across countries in Europe. The gaps in infrastructure are translating themselves into gaps in productivity. Hence, Europe is reproducing the same imbalances based on the shaky foundations of austerity-driven policy. The alternative to that is very clear. Any economic student with some common sense of understanding of how the economy is working would see the need for a massive investment drive in Europe, and this is not coming. This is not coming despite we are experiencing the lowest interest rates, longest period of lowest interest rates in Europe, but public investment is still a taboo. Fiscal compact still rules, and this is despite the recommendations coming from even very mainstream international institutions such as the IMF, or mainstream think tanks such as the OECD. The neoliberal governments are not accepting such advice. So attempts to weather the negative effects of the imbalances in Europe, attempts to weather the still persisting effects of the Great Recession are still very much relying on monetary policy. And again, European Central Bank, far from being a progressive institution, is actually calling for support from the governments that monetary policy can't do any further heavy lifting to weather the crisis. Fiscal policy and public spending is required, but again, this is finding no reception. Now, this is not a very conducive environment to further gender equality. Fiscal conservatism and its negative effects on growth and tax revenues has intensified the competition over the use of our already limited public resources. This has translated itself into massive cuts in local, municipal, as well as central public services. And women are the core users of these services. They are also the ones who are producing these services, so they are being double hit by austerity. On top of that double hit, services are eroding, they're losing their jobs, or they're having to live with public sector pay caps in some countries. Then they're also, of course, the ones to go back home and take the slack that is left unfilled, undersupplied by the public sector jobs in terms of rising domestic unpaid need for care work. The care of children, care of elderly is falling once again on the shoulders of women who are being hit by cuts in public services. Now, within all this gloomy perspective, feminist economists are trying to highlight one crucial aspect of public services, particularly public services in social care, elderly care, child care, but also in general in health care and education. We try to emphasize the importance of social care and child care as part of infrastructure, just to chime with the infrastructure in terms of transport, housing and energy, which is the physical infrastructure. we are trying to coin this phrase social infrastructure. And of course, the importance of social infrastructure in terms of promoting development in a society has been underestimated by even the progressives for a long time. But it is written in our constitutions that it's a human right to have access to decent care and decent education. And of course, we have to make the case that this is the core of a long-term sustainable and productive society as well. So this will bring me and the rest of my talk to the alternative to the dead-end road of austerity that puts social infrastructure to the core of a new type of progressive politics that highlights the importance of public provision of care, child care and elderly care, which of course is not only supplying a very basic human need and a human right on decent terms, but it is also has an enormous impact on unleashing the productive potential of women. So it is, of course, increasing the labor market opportunities of women who, in the lack of the decent provision, public provision of care, have to do that unpaid, invisibly at home. And of course, if this is provided decently, it's a major step towards increasing gender equality. In most mainstream policymaking, this is completely underestimated whenever there is some talk, some lip service to gender equality, and progressives have to really fill in this gap. Now, so that brings me to the small political window of opportunity that we have in this otherwise very gloomy days dominated by austerity in the aftermath of the Great Recession. We are facing multiple crises in our societies, and to tackle the multiple crises of inequality, of an aging society, the deficit of care, and climate change, we need policies that will hit all these targets simultaneously. And gender-aware economic policymaking sees a lot of complementarities between these different targets. Inclusive and sustainable development and gender equality are complementary to each other. Poverty alleviation, decent job creation, ecological sustainability, and gender equality are complementary to each other. I'll try to show how we see these in the rest of my talk. In the age of austerity, with all the cuts to public funding, we often think that there is a competition for resources. Indeed, if we try to hit policies for gender equality, I will argue later in the talk that it will help us to hit our targets about ecological sustainability and climate change more easily, and you will see how. To be able to grab this political window of opportunity to hit these multiple targets, to tackle the multiple crises our societies are facing, we of course need a very active policymaking stance that mobilizes all the tools of policymaking that we know, that does mobilize public investment, that mobilizes industrial policy, trying to hit all these targets simultaneously, with an aim to achieve high employment, decent jobs with decent pay for both men and women, with equality and also with an eye on both social and ecological sustainability. Now, very often when I start talking about these, and particularly when I start talking about need for public investment, need for public provision of social infrastructure along with physical infrastructure, politicians ask me about how to finance that. We have a restraint, they assume. Now, this is outright wrong economics, and I'll show you again in the rest of the talk why. But just to cut a long story short, public investment partially self-finances itself, particularly if you invest in the right direction. It does generate the jobs, along with that the income that raises the tax revenues, that finances part of itself. Of course, spending is not the magic bullet that will sort all the problems alone. This is why we need to mobilize all tools of public policy, including monetary policy, including taxation policy, and I'll try to give you some numbers later to give you some ammunition that these are not just empty words. It is possible, and yes, we can do that. And of course, if we really are serious about achieving all our goals without postponing gender equality to some distant future, we really have to redefine what we understand about crucial infrastructure spending. And this is particularly a policy matter that we've been trying to pursue at the Women's Budget Group in Britain in our conversations with the official opposition party, the Labour Party, who is, of course, as you know now, contesting the Conservative government in the election debate. We have 3 weeks left to the result. But what we are trying to show is be bold, define spending, public spending in childcare, education, elderly care, healthcare as infrastructure spending, and redefine your fiscal credibility rule accordingly. It is very difficult. It's very difficult even with progressives. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So let me try to just build the blocks of what I see as the crucial aspects of gender-aware, feminist economic policy for an equality-led and sustainable development program in Europe. And I use the word development because I am trying to shift the focus away from growth to human development. That doesn't mean that all the policies we're promoting will not create growth. Of course it will create growth, but the aim isn't growth as such, but the aim is development in the large sense of the word. And it is sort of strange that in one of the richest parts of the world today we have the need to talk about development because some parts of our societies, in terms of the provision of some of the basic necessities of human life, ranging from care to housing, is underdeveloped. So I think the use of the word development is here quite deliberate. I see as the core of economic policy making focus public investment and public jobs in 2 broad areas of infrastructure. And I'll start with social infrastructure because it is underestimated. Now, at Women's Budget Group, we have defined social investment, social infrastructure, as infrastructure where the benefits do not just accrue to individual users, but have a public good character. Hence, the benefits of such infrastructure investment accrues to the society as a whole. These are goods and services, access to which is seen as a human right. And these are also goods and services in particular, if you leave it to the private supply, governed by profit motive of the private enterprises, they will be undersupplied. They will be undersupplied, and at the same time they will be supplied as an expensive luxury service that is only accessible by the privileged elite. For me, care is a very typical example of that. If you think of what elderly care opportunities are available in our societies, of course, if you are rich, if you have the wealth, sufficient wealth, to save for your old age, you can imagine having a very nice residential care provided to you. These are very expensive privately provided services. The resources that we have for social care that is municipally provided or publicly provided, changes depending on the European country we're talking about, is increasingly more undersupplied and is far from enough to meet the needs of our aging society. Now, this is for me a very typical case of a service that requires public, not-for-profit provision. By public, I have a broad understanding of the public. It can be state provision, it can be municipal, local provision, it can be cooperatives supported by some public infrastructure. But we need some sort of public collective ownership in the provision of such services. This applies to childcare, this applies to education at all levels, this applies to health. So all these things, education, childcare, early years education, elderly care, social care, health care, meet all these criteria that the benefits do not accrue just to the individual but to the society as well, and they would be undersupplied if you leave it to the profit motive. So in this part of the world, in Europe, one of the richest parts of the world, with a proud history of welfare state, surely we have achieved the means and the thinking to secure universal public childcare and universal social care as a coordinated policy. Surely this shouldn't be something that is just happening in some parts of Europe. Surely this is something Europe can coordinate to push the states to provide the resources for the universal provision of these. In terms of gendering economic policy making in Europe, this would be my top priority. This is too important to leave it to different welfare state regimes that are differing fundamentally across different countries in Europe. And we often talk about budget deficit in Europe. We have a much more fundamental deficit. We have a care deficit. Now, care deficit is being felt in women's decision to stop caring, to stop becoming mothers, because they feel the brunt of having the double day of caring and working if they try to care. Now, if we want to sort out this care deficit, we cannot leave it to women's unpaid, invisible work any longer. We have to take it to our public hands to provide the care services needed such that we become a caring society. Now, I'll try to be now, put on my macroeconomist hat on and be very instrumentalist in order to convince the politicians why meeting this care deficit is important from a very narrow macroeconomic productivity-focused perspective as well. If we provide those social care, child care, education, health services at a sufficient level for our societies, this will have tremendous direct as well as indirect impact on productivity. For one thing, of course, it's no-brainer. If we talk about early childhood education, it's one of the most formative years of human beings. They will create more productive human beings in the next decades. You can see the time lags here. It's very different from investing in vocational education, apprenticeships, which are very easy to instrumentalize in terms of creating the skills to create higher productivity within a couple of years. Here I'm talking about a very long-term perspective of investment. Invest in your children, invest in your nurseries, you will get more civilized, more creative, more innovative, more productive citizens, well, in 20 years' time. This is where the need for public provision comes to play. Only the public sector, only we collectively, not a narrow-minded, short-termist, private profit motive-seeking private enterprise, but only the long-term perspective of the public sector and we as a society collectively can see the fruits of an investment in early school, preschool education, nursery, childcare, that will deliver its fruits in 20 years. Now, you could say this works fine for childcare, it works fine for education in general, it even works fine for healthcare. How does it work for elderly care? You could say, of course, we should care for elderly people, but you can't really justify it on productivity grounds. Well, yes, maybe not directly. Maybe when we are thinking of the last years of our life, we are not going to be going back to productive labor force anymore. But we are missing here some of the very indirect impact of not providing decent public, sufficient elderly care. Because care will happen. Elderly people will not be miraculously taken care of on their own. Women, relatives, daughters, younger sisters will take care of these elderly people in the absence of sufficient, decent social care provision. These women will be taking leave from their jobs, will be shifting from full-time jobs to part-time jobs to fill this care deficit if we don't find a solution of collectively providing the care our elderly people need. So that would be the indirect impact, unleashing the productive potential of women who, in the absence of sufficient care supply, would be filling this gap by their unpaid, invisible labor. And of course, there is another indirect channel we often forget about. Societies with a decent social security provision are more innovative, more productive thereby. Why? Because if you do not worry about the care of your old mother, disabled child, or your son or daughter in the nursery, if you trust that that care is being provided by a highly skilled, highly paid, highly motivated individual, you will be more productive at work because you wouldn't be checking your phone all the time in the fear that something is terribly going wrong at home because your mother is being taken care of by a social care worker who has precious 15 minutes to visit her in the house, and if something goes wrong, nobody will be there to help her. You will have to be the one to rush out of work, to travel the distance, to look out if everything is fine. If you don't trust if the nursery is properly staffed, if there are enough nursery teachers per child in the nursery, you would be all the time alert, checking your text messages if something is wrong at home. You would be taking a career which is less ambitious than your full potential because you will often try to fill the gap between the nursery opening hours and your job's requirements about presenteeism. So social security, the proper provision of that, makes people more focused, more concentrated, and also more innovative. It also makes us more innovative, I suppose, if we think that when we are old, there will be the social solidarity out there to take care of us. Now, all these, of course, would work not just by providing the services and the hours, but providing them as decent services where motivated individuals with high skills provide these services. That brings me to my second point. This isn't cheap investment. You can't get it done by paying minimum wage, below living wage standards to the nursery teachers or social care workers. This has to be seen as a decent career path where there are clear education requirements and a decent return to those schooling investments made by individuals. I often ask this question to people: why is a nursery teacher or a social care worker paid so much less than the banker? With the banker, you deposit your money. With the nursery teacher, you leave your child. With the social care worker, you leave your mother, your father, or your disabled child or relative. Who is more important to you? Which is more important to you, your money or your child, your mother? I have never met someone who says, my money is more important to me. Even in this very individualistic time where greed has taken over, when one thinks, common sense tells all of us, actually, our people are more important to us. So shouldn't then these people be paid at least as well as the people who are managing our money? You could say the people who manage our money are highly educated. Well, then I would ask, why is a nursery teacher not requiring the same years of education? Obviously, then, if you ask the person to invest so much schooling, you would expect the person to also expect a decent pay. Surely we need to see these as a proper investment, a proper career track, and a properly regulated area where people will be, both men and women, will be motivated to work. Now, I'll just coin a phrase here, or remind you of a phrase that a feminist economist has already coined. To chime with the green jobs or green investment, İpek İlkaracan, a feminist economist, has coined the term purple investment, purple jobs. Purple jobs are these jobs that I've been talking about. Jobs in childcare, healthcare, education, elderly care. They are purple not because we see them as jobs to be done by women only. We would very much like these jobs to become jobs that are desirable also by ambitious men who are after ambitious career tracks. But we call them purple jobs because they will unleash this potential of the unpaid, invisible work of women. Now, I will say something else that will sound hopefully more novel to you. These purple jobs, İpek İlkaracan says, are also green. They're very complementary to green jobs because they are also about nurturing. It's a different concept of policy target. I will add to that one more thing. If you think of these jobs, childcare, education, elderly care, these are very labor-intensive jobs. You regard to deliver them properly, they have to be very labor-intensive. You need to have a lot of people doing these jobs. You need more nursery teachers per child. You need more care workers per elderly person to provide a decent provision of these services. Now, so that means we will actually be able to create a lot more jobs per growth, per €1 new GDP we create. By definition, they are also very low carbon jobs. We don't require a whole lot of machinery and equipment and energy consumption. We need a lot of human time and human contact to provide these sort of services at a decent level. So they are low carbon and labor intensive, which means you can achieve many decent jobs, provided you pay for them obviously, per carbon emission. So they are at the same time therefore green. So therefore gender-aware policies are both socially sustainable. It tackles gender inequality, it tackles the care crisis of our societies, it tackles our social crisis, but also it tackles the ecological crisis. It is one way of meeting our targets for a low-carbon green economy. Now, I'll say a few more words about the macroeconomic impact of policies targeting gender equality. Now, I've done a lot of work for Foundation of European Progressive Studies, before that for the International Labour Organization of the United Nations, promoting alternative growth policies that go along with equality. Tackling gender inequality would be at the core of tackling inequality in general. Gender inequality is one of the core reasons of personal income inequality, which has increased in all of our societies, including in Europe. And gender inequality is an important reason why also the distribution of our national incomes between wage and profit income is so much skewed. So if we were to eliminate gender pay gaps, that would help us, they take us a long way in tackling the inequality between the top 1% and the rest of our society, but also it would help us increasing the share of labor income in national income. Gender equality will take us closer to having a higher share of wages in national income. Now, I have done a lot of work proving that increasing wage income in total income, the share of wages in total income, in Europe would lead to higher growth. So Europe as a whole is a wage-led economy, and I'm very happy to be able to tell you today that Finland is a wage-led economy, in the sense that if you increase the share of wages in national income, you will get higher growth. Or if you continue to do what we have been doing in the last 3 decades, meaning squeeze the share of wages in national income, increase capital share, increase profits at the expense of labor income, then you will suffer from lower growth, you will suffer from stagnation in demand. Wage-led growth is actually synonymous to equality-led growth in general, and gender equality is a core dimension of achieving an equality-led growth in Europe. There are some very good reasons why that happens, and we are working on some very new macroeconomic forecasting to give more ammunition in that sense too. I have done the estimations for the UK only at the moment, but if you increase gender equality, household spending and consumption goes up. And women also spend differently. There is also evidence that women focus on spending that benefit child care, that benefit education of the children, that benefit nutrition of the children. There are very strong links between more income in the hands of women in the households and long-term health outcomes of children and a society in general. So this is something that contributes to social infrastructure from, if you like, the private household sphere. Also, more pragmatically, gender equality, closing gender pay gaps, creates more demand for consumption, which then goes back to the firms, private investors, private enterprises, in terms of demand for the goods and services they are providing. That stimulates private investment as well. That stimulates private investment also indirectly because it stimulates productivity. This is interesting because when we think of private investment, we often believe that it's about profitability. Yes, of course it's about profitability, but also demand. So gender equality does create some demand for firms, that's the good news for them, and private investment. But we think of profitability as something that you can achieve by squeezing wages. This is such a short-sighted way of looking at profitability because profitability is not just about wage that you pay to the employees, but also about their productivity. You could imagine increasing wages, but also stimulating productivity. That actually could potentially lead to even lower labor costs per unit of output and hence higher profitability. We have again forged the numbers. Higher gender equality triggered by higher public spending in social infrastructure does create tremendous long-term productivity gains for private businesses, and that does help to increase their profitability and hence private investment too. And of course, on top of it, you have to think of infrastructure in general as something that improves the business environment for private firms. We have been going down the low road of squeezing wages, austerity, and cutting public spending for too long. If we were to reverse that and opt for the high road of high wages, decent provision of public, social, and physical infrastructure, that actually creates potentially a much more conducive environment for private investment as well. Now, here are some numbers that I had promised originally, just to give you the confidence that these are not just some nice words. We have estimated a macroeconomic model for the 15 European Union member states, old European Union member states, which have long enough data for us to be able to do some statistical analysis. And we have simulated the results of a policy mix, which is about increasing public spending by 1% of GDP in each country simultaneously every year, increasing the share of labor income, wages, in national income by 1 percentage point every year. Mind you, this is a very small step towards reversing austerity and reversing wage stagnation in Europe. Just to give you a feel, in the past 3 decades, the share of wages have fallen by about 10 percentage points in Europe. This is just a minor step every year that we can take to reverse inequality. And along with that, we have said, well, let's rely on a third fiscal policy tool, more progressive taxation, which is again very modest. It's just about reversing the inequality in the distribution of the tax burden between labor and capital, increase the tax rate on capital income by 1%, and decrease the tax on labor income by 1 percentage point. Overall, we get very strong results. The impact of wage policies is positive. They are small, but I'm confident to say that at least they're not negative. They do not prevent growth. They do not hinder growth. Quite on the contrary, if anything, they stimulate growth. The overall stimulus is, of course, a lot stronger if you mix good labor market policies with macroeconomic public spending policies. And of course, you could do that in one single country, you would still benefit, but the results are tremendously stronger if all the European Union member states implement these policies simultaneously. There are very strong cross-border spillover of fiscal policy as well as wage policies. So this invites me to, of course, advocate policy coordination at European Union level for both fiscal policy and wage policies. We've been successfully coordinating, sadly, the wrong policies in Europe. The good news is that we can coordinate. If we can coordinate the wrong wage moderation and fiscal compact policies, we can then coordinate surely the reverse of that, meaning policies to increase wage share and policies to increase public spending. With that, in just 1 year, we are getting 6.7% more gross domestic product in Europe as a whole. And we are getting, in Finland, a lot stronger results. I just had these results at the end of December, so I'm very happy to be in Helsinki today. As an outcome of such coordinated policy mix in Finland, we could get 12% higher GDP. You could ask me what's happening to private investment. Are the private investors not shying away? We have higher wages, higher taxation on capital. Well, no. Private investment as a ratio to gross domestic product in Europe on average is also increasing by 2%. Again, results in Finland are much stronger. You get 5.9% more private investment in Finland. Public spending is exactly crowding in private investment. It's not crowding out. There's no evidence of that because it creates, of course, demand, but also it creates the business environment businesses are very hungry for. We are all worried about budget balance in policymaking world, so we did crunch the numbers. Public budget balance is improving in Europe as an outcome of these policies, more so in Finland. If you want to be very cautious, at least you could say these policies are surely neutral in terms of budget balance. It's not going to create more deficit, more public debt. And I'm often asked by trade unionists, would that not create inflation, particularly in Nordic countries where social partnership is important? Well, no. A 1 percentage point increase in the wage share will lead to a one-off increase in prices in Europe about 1.5%, in Finland 1.8%. If you think that we are at the verge of almost a deflationary era, our advice to the European Central Bank is if they want to hit their inflation target of 2%, as you know, that's the inflation target of European Central Bank, they should do as we tell them. They should promote the high road policies to increase wage share. Now, how do we do that? Particularly, what are the gender-aware policies, labor market policies to increase the wage share and gender wage equality? It's about thinking of re-regulating our labor markets to achieve a dual-earner, dual-carer model, where we have work-life balance, which is an essential component of my understanding of decent jobs. We have to again revisit one of the oldest demands of the labor movement, that's about shorter working hours. And we have to think of equal incentives for both men and women regarding paternity leave, which we heard also in the opening remarks. And of course, all that becomes feasible only if you have a decent universal childcare and social care. Our trade unions have to be more aware about and more proactive about tackling gender wage equality. We need collective voice, but we also need our trade unions to be more inclusive, such that we're not just talking about equality, but also gender equality as a core part of equality. And in my experience, establishing minimum wage that is worthy of the concept of a living wage takes us closer towards gender equality as well. So it's about creating institutions, it's about state policies to set the rules in the labor market, and then we can make it. We know these policies. I'm out of time, so I'm not going to be able to say much about shortening working hours, but of course we have to think how a shorter work hour should work for both men and women, and a model of redefining and redistributing also care work. Because despite my advocacy for the public provision of care, the people we are caring for will also want to be cared by us, and we will probably also want to care for our elderly and our children at least for some time of our work day. So it has to leave us enough time to be workers as well as carers, so long that there is a decent public infrastructure and a decent redistribution of that private household care time between both men and women, and it does require a rethinking of how we want to go forward with shortening working hours. Surely it's not about having one long weekend to go fishing, but it's about having shorter days every day of the week. There is some work behind it, so if you wish to check some of my numbers, please do visit our webpage at Greenwich Political Economy Research Center, and I look forward to your comments if we still have some time. Thank you.
I was definitely thinking that I'm going to give your email address and your telephone number to our finance minister and the ministers who are trying to make the social and healthcare reform in Finland. I think this would have been an excellent talk to them. We could take 1-2 questions if you have immediately now, or then they can continue in the panel debate. So I'm glad to proceed to the next introduction as well, but I think there was lots of food for thought in this one. Please.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was extremely interesting and useful for all of us. So my name is Anna Elomäki and I'm from the University of Helsinki, and I was wondering about these calculations or this modeling that you have made. So are you able to reflect on how come that the GDP growth in Finland would be so much higher than the average of the EU 15? What are the features of the Finnish economy or society that would make this type of policy mix so effective?
Should I collect?
Yes, we collect the 2 questions and then you answer at the same time.
Thank you. I'm still trying to formulate a question. I'm Eva Houtbeckers from Aalto University and working with economic stuff. And I'm interested perhaps on your personal experiences a bit more, even talking with your findings with different stakeholders. Thank you.
But the answers have to be short as well.
Yes. Okay. Of course, really very happy that I could talk about this in Helsinki, where the results are stronger than in the UK. So if you, I had presented the same research piece in the UK early May, and all the results for Britain are lower than the European average, whereas in the Finnish case they're all stronger. One of the reasons why this is the case is particularly in terms of public spending impact. Finland apparently is spending it in the correct way, in the right way, that really has a very strong impact on private investment. And we are having a very cautious model in the sense that public spending does have some effect on debt, and that if it has a negative effect, if it leads to a rise in interest rates, would have some negative effect on private investment. That's in our model. So in Finland we find all of it, meaning private investment does respond positively to public spending, but also there is a negative effect, a little bit negative effect coming from the debt effect. But when you net all these effects out, the positive impact of public spending is very dominant. And this isn't the case in all countries. In the UK, I literally felt such a big burden, particularly since I'm working in Britain. I would like to see more of an optimistic picture about the assessment of the impact of public spending, but you struggle to find a positive impact of public spending on private investment, in the short run at least. In the long run, there are now some good news coming, but it's coming through productivity and very indirectly. In Finland, particularly, both public investment in physical infrastructure, that is in public transport, in public housing, in public energy, as well as what we call social infrastructure spending, which is in our national accounts actually current spending, but we take out the part of current spending in childcare, in education and healthcare and social care. So education includes childcare, but also it would include universities. So what we call this social infrastructure investment, which is actually a large part of current spending, has a positive effect, as well as the physical infrastructure. Not so much to my surprise, other current spending, say in defense or whatever other current spending you could have in, say, public security, isn't having an impact on private investment. And this is not the case in all the countries, particularly the impact of social infrastructure spending being so strong is the case in some countries. The details are in the paper, but Finland is one of these countries. Austria, Netherlands is another. In France, we find positive impact of social infrastructure, but not the other types of spending. So countries are very diverse. This tells me something about how they're spending, what the public sector is doing. The other interesting thing about Finland, though Finland isn't alone in that, in the majority of the countries in Europe, private profitability isn't the main driver of private investment, but demand is. So if you do the policy mix we have, which is about increasing wage share, this isn't having a negative effect on private investment, but it is having a very strong effect on demand through household consumption, to which private investment responds very strongly. So we had very high multiplier effects for Finland overall too. And one more thing about a small open economy. Now the exports of Finland are sensitive to labor costs, and we do control for it. Higher labor costs does lead to some decline in terms of exports, but it's not the thing that drives imports. So imports isn't about labor costs. It looks to me like Finland is importing things that it's not producing anymore. It's not so much about responding to higher domestic prices versus foreign prices, but obviously if you do grow, you will have more import demand, and this is in our model too. But the multipliers, the multiplier effect of any increase in demand, stimulating further investment and further consumption was very strong, and that does generate jobs. Now, how do we get response to that sort of discussion? There's a lot of recognition that inequality is corrosive and it's destabilizing. So that is the good news. So there's some window of opportunity. However, a lot of the mainstream is still thinking of inequality affecting more the supply side, meaning because of inequality, there's lower investment in skills and education, and this is leading to lower productivity. Demand is totally forgotten in macroeconomics. This is a very Keynesian analysis. I feel like this is a feminist Keynesian analysis, and of course, this is in the mainstream analysis completely missing. We are trying to make our way through, but I often say to think tanks, activists, trade unions, we need efforts on both sides. We are doing this research, but it's not, change will not gonna come because I sit in my office and crunch these numbers. Change will come if movements do use these results, and we are working with Trade Union Advisory Committee to OECD to make an impact on OECD. Without them, we won't be seen by the OECD, if you know what I mean. This is why we work with Foundation of European Progressive Studies, other think tanks, trade union economists. My experience with the Labour Party, this is important. We do actively work with Labour Party. I'm in their economic advisory group. So are other women's budget group members. They take all the arguments we produce. It's a very different leadership now. However, they're so much under pressure from the mainstream media and from the neoclassical thinking. Their fiscal credibility rule says we will borrow to invest in infrastructure for capital spending only and not for current spending. We tell them, look, childcare, education, healthcare, social care is social infrastructure. They agree, but they're so scared that they would be seen as fiddling the numbers and statistics if they say, this is social infrastructure, we will borrow if need be to spend in social investment as well. They don't dare to do it. So what they say is, okay, we will tax to be able to spend in social infrastructure, and for physical infrastructure, we will borrow. And this has been seen as going back to 1945 in the UK, if you follow the media. So the public thinking is very far away from this. Though I should say, not the public thinking. These policies are popular with people, but the mainstream media headlines, of course, is doing all they can to make them look unrealistic, infeasible, and not credible. This is why we need to work together. Thank you very much.
Excellent. We are very much looking forward for the British election campaign and how much these themes are on the agenda and how they are dealt with. Ooh, exciting times. We already went quite a long way for the Finnish case, but let's broaden up back to the bit Nordic perspective on these issues. And our next speaker is Professor Emerita Anita Nyberg from University of Stockholm, a former professor in gender perspective on work and economy at the National Institute for Working Life. I hope I got it right. Her research interest consists of gender equality policies, gender perspective on the economy, and of the male norm in labor force statistics. And now her topic is feminist approaches to economic policy in the Nordic countries. Please take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for being here. And I'm very impressed that you arranged a seminar about feminist approach. Now, in Sweden, the topic today is feminist approaches to economic policy. And in Sweden, there are 5 parties out of 8 that call themselves feminist parties. And it's the Center Party, the Liberal Party, the Green Party, the Social Democratic Party, and the Leftist Party. And even today also the government calls itself a feminist government. And there is also this small party, the Feminist Initiative, which is not represented in the parliament, but in some municipalities, for example in Stockholm. So this means, of course, that there are many different feminist approaches to economic policy, and that a feminist approach can mean very different things. What should be included in economic policy can also be discussed. Now, for example, we heard about shorter working hours. That is, for example, the topic from the leftist party in Sweden. They think that would further gender equality. While other parties would say, no, we need more hours and more people working. Otherwise, we won't have a sustainable welfare state. And that would be very bad for women and for gender equality. This Swedish feminist government, they have invited people from EU countries to what is called a mutual learning seminar about taxation. And I was asked to write the discussion paper from Sweden about the introduction of individual taxation in Sweden. And I think introducing individual taxation in Sweden or in general is a very good example and a main example of a feminist approach to economic policy. So I want to talk about that to start with, but then I will also take some other examples, and I also will mention some places where I think we need a feminist approach. So anyway, in 1960 in Sweden, the parliament decided, almost everyone voted and said family-based taxation should be maintained. Individual taxation was not a question on the agenda, but a couple of years later, the situation had changed completely. There were strong arguments in favor of individual taxation, and organizations and parties started to reconsider their positions. And in 1971, individual-based taxation was introduced. Now, behind this was the sudden interest in individual taxation was a result of this intense discussion in the 1960s in Sweden about so-called gender roles at that time. And they applied, I would say, a feminist approach to individual taxation. The discussion in Sweden, they was started by individuals. They did not belong to any party or any organization. It was young, well-educated women that started this discussion. But there were also some influential social democratic and liberal women that participated in this discussion. And for example, was Karin Kopp. She was a feminist economist, and she was also Sweden's first female member of the cabinet, of the government in the 1940s. She argued that the current tax system is built on ideas from the last century, when the ideal was that a wife only worked for the family, and when one was made to believe that the husband supported his wife. It was made to believe, I think is. She was, as I said, a feminist and an economist. So she calculated the GDP, and she included women's unpaid work in Sweden between, I think it was 1860 and 1931 or something. Anyway, the women who advocated individual taxation argued that family-based taxation was unfair to single persons and benefited, as they said, the not fully occupied housewife without children, especially in high-income families. The conservative side of the debate maintained that the tax system should be neutral in relation to married women's employment. Women's right to be supported housewife should not be questioned. The radical side objected that no tax system is neutral. This existing system benefited housewives and was based on an old-fashioned idea that married women should be supported by their husbands. Society had no reason to support this kind of a family, especially not if there were no children there. So women's labor force participation, gender equality, and the dual earner, dual carer family model were put forward as a modern alternative to the old male breadwinner, female housewife family. So, and in this discussion, women's economic independence from men was strongly underlined or seen as a condition for women's emancipation, simply. The problem then, for the Social Democrats who were in power, was to design an individual tax system in a way that it did not foremost benefit high-income families and was unfavorable to low-income, male breadwinner, female housewife families. But when it was shown by these individual women in articles in the press that the deductions that a husband can do for his non-employed wife, and also lower tax for married people than for single persons, was more beneficial for high-income families than for low-income families. Then the Social Democrats could buy this idea about individual taxation. So a women's question, which initially was perceived as an upper-class problem, could be reformulated as a working-class disadvantage, and then it could be accepted. So the Prime Minister, Olof Palme, at that time, he said that this change will mainly benefit low-income families, but he also stressed that it was good for women's emancipation and for women's labor force participation. So here, eventually, this meant that the arguments about married women's labor force participation, gender equality, and income distribution all pointed towards an individual income taxation. The opposition came mainly from the conservative political camp, the Conservative Party at that time, the tax lawyers, representatives from the Swedish Confederation of Professional Associations and taxpayers' organizations, but also from trade unions, and from within the Social Democratic Party and the Social Democratic women. And the housewives, they organized a campaign for signing against this introduction of individual taxation. And they collected 60,000 signatures, which was quite a lot at that time. And they demonstrated outside the parliament. I think there was a drawback, though, because the woman who organized this, nobody has said that, but I think it might have been a problem. She was a wife of a professor, and not a working class housewife. So anyway, but influential men in the press, in the political parties, and in the social partners, they took stand for the young, well-educated women who spoke about change and presented a new ideology and a new contract between women and men. Then, in this new individual tax system, which was introduced then in 1971, husband and wives were seen as two separate individual economic subjects, but there was still family-based parts in the tax system. So, for example, individual taxation on business and farm income was still there, what was most important was that unearned income, that is income from property, capital gain, support, and other things were still on their family basis. And this was not taken away until 1988. And there was also a special, which I think maybe was smart, because there was and I think this has been also in other countries, you had a housewife deduction. If your wife did not work, you could make a deduction. And this in Sweden, this was introduced at the same time, so the low-income male breadwinner housewife family should not be too much hurt. But they kept this deduction at a nominal value. So the value of it decreased over time. But it wasn't taken away until 1991. Joint taxation of wealth was in force until such taxation was eliminated altogether in 2007. So it took 36 years from the start to the end to a fully individual taxation. Now, this also meant that this new taxation system talked about another kind of contract between women and men. So it was not only an economic question, it was also a culture or something question. Women and men were two individual economic subjects. And I think it's also important when you think about this individual taxation that, I mean, we know quite a lot about women's struggle for the right to vote, but we know very little about women's struggle to have the right to pay taxes. There's very little research about this, I think, in the world. I don't know, but I think so. Anyway, today, or most OECD countries have had family-based taxation at the beginning of the 1970s. But today, almost all countries have separate taxation or individual taxation, or you could have an option. So 23 out of 34 OECD countries have individual-based taxation in 2015. 5 have purely family-based tax system. Estonia, France, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Switzerland. And in a number of countries you can choose: Germany, Ireland, Norway, Poland, Spain, and the United States. But even those countries that have individual-based taxation have some elements of family-based, some family-based elements in their taxation system. So, the only 2 countries that have fully individual taxation system is Sweden and Finland, actually. But there is also but, because some other researchers you can classify the countries in different ways, actually. I mean, there can be some differences. Okay, so as we think in Sweden that we were first in 1971, but that's not the case. Norway introduced individual taxation as an option in 1959. And Denmark introduced it in 1967, but they still had some family-based elements in there, and they still do, as you can see here, Denmark. And Anita, where are you? Down there. She has told me that in Finland you actually had individual taxations in the 1930s, but it was taken away and it became joint taxation again, and then individual taxation in Finland came 1976. One area where I think we need more feminist approaches or gender perspective is income distribution. The family is still often seen as in spite of the individual taxation, the family is still seen as the basic economic unit. For example, in studies of income distribution. And the point of departure is in general disposable income. The incomes are distributed between the individuals in the household, taking into consideration the number of persons to be supported. And the disposable income, they represent the level of consumption or the economic standard in the household. And the households are then used in these studies, usually both as the unit of income, but also as the unit of analysis. There are other income distribution studies where they use the household as a unit of income, but the individual as a unit of of analysis. It's still the point of departure is the economic standard of the individual, and it is decided by the household income, not by the individual income. So in a household with two adults, wife and husband are allocated equally big incomes, since the total income is distributed evenly, even though one person, usually the husband, makes more money than the other, usually the woman. So irrespective of which of these methods you use, it is the household that makes what the individual have, what kind of economic standard the individual have. And who is making the money, or who is making more money than the other, it doesn't matter. It is of no interest. And I mean, this has to do, I think, with economic theory, and Gary Becker sees the family as a unit, and work is divided between husband and wife as a rational choice for the family. So that there's no need for any discussion. But this perspective on the family as a unit free of conflicts and fair distribution of economic standard is in sharp contrast to the feminist perspective, which maintain that the gender division of labor in the family, the male breadwinner model, and women's dependence on men are central mechanisms through which women's subordinate position in the family and in society at large is upheld. That is the basic thing. So according to feminist theory, the key to women's emancipation and economic independence is employment for her, and wage work for her, and income of her own. A woman's income gives her a voice, a possibility to influence the decisions in the family, and she has the possibility to leave the relationship if it's not satisfactory. So individual income is very important, and not only the family income. And I think we should try to do more when it comes to doing income distribution studies on an individual basis. Now, in Sweden we have done investigations about economic gender equality 3 times. One time in 1997, one in 2005, and one in 2015. In the 2 first investigations, the goal of gender equality policy was that women and men should have the same possibilities, rights, and duties. And women and men should have the same possibilities to economic independence. Now, I was involved in this, and I was thinking, what is economic independence? I mean, you have to know that to be able to investigate if we have come closer or not. So I pestered my colleagues about this. What do you mean by economic independence? And the interesting thing was that when I asked the women, they said it is to have a job of your own, a wage, so you can support yourself. But when I asked the men what economic independence was, they said it is to have so much own means that I don't have to wage work. So economic independence, I think, have very different meanings when it comes to women and men. But we very seldom speak about men as economically independent or dependent. Anyway, they are not dependent on women, but women who are economically dependent are on men. So I think the concept economic independence has, when it concerns women, a gender perspective, while it is when it is for men, it has a class perspective. So it has different meanings. So in the new gender equality goals in Sweden, which were accepted in 2006, the concept economic self-sufficiency, självständighet, was used instead of economic independence. And they say that the motive for this change was that the concept economic independence has been used in order for women to be able to support themselves and children, if any, and not being dependent on a man. Since most women and men are dependent on wages and transfer for their support, the concept economic independence is partly misleading. Very few are independent in the meaning that they have private means big enough so that they do not need to work for their support. But to be dependent on work income is not lack of independence. The government therefore proposes that the concept economic self-sufficiency is used in order to mark that women and men should have the same right and possibility to support themselves and their children. But the problem, I was involved in the next one also, investigation, and I have problems again with this the definition of gender equality, economic gender equality. It says that the goal for economic gender equality today is women and men must have the same opportunities and conditions as regards paid work, which give economic self-sufficiency throughout life. Now, I don't think economic self-sufficiency and economic gender equality is the same thing. Economic self-sufficiency is about reaching a certain level of income so you can support yourself and children if you have any. But gender equality is that women and men have about the same income, the same level of incomes. So women and men can be economically gender equal without being economically self-sufficient. Economic gender equality is, for example, common among young people. They have often, the difference in income is not so big among young people, but they can't support themselves. While older people, middle-aged people, the income differences are often much bigger between women and men, but they can both support themselves. So it's not the same thing, I think. Anyway, the Swedish government has made an annex to the budget every year since 2002, and it's about economic gender equality between women and men. And there they describe the incomes of women and men. And this is then from work income, and then you apply income of capital and transfers and all this. And you can see that the women's work income as a percentage of men's is 74%. But then if you look at individual disposable income, and this is individual, I mean, it's the money that women and men individually have earned or received as transfer. It's nothing to do with the family or anything. It's not involved. It's 80%. And so the work income is 74%, but individual disposable income is 80%. So transfer and taxes even out the gender differences in income. It helps for women. But also when you look at income of capital, for example, women have much less income of capital. So one way of, if that would be the only goal, gender equality, then you should tax capital more than labor. Yeah. Well, anyway, this gives an idea what you could do to change the economic gender equality. This one. Anyway, women's economic self-sufficiency, then, being able to support themselves, has increased since the 1970s. Cohabiting women's share on cohabiting married women's share of household has increased from 31% in 1975 to 43% in 2014. And this can mostly be explained by women's longer working hours and higher employment rate. But on the other hand, nothing much has changed since middle of 1990s. The share of cohabiting married households where the woman has a higher income than her husband has increased also, since the middle of the 1990s. In 1995, 21% of the women had a higher disposable income than her husband, and this share increased to around 28% in 2014. In this annex, it's also discussed how the different policy proposals will influence gender equality and women and men and their incomes. The same problem as with income distribution studies is in poverty studies. Again, a household is defined as being poor if its average level of resources falls below the poverty level. So this means if you live in a household which is poor, then you as an individual is also poor. And this is a problem because the household is a unit of analysis. And then it might be hard to judge what to do about income poverty. And today, when we want to say something about women's and men's individual poverty, then you only can use, or not only, but it is used data comparing single women and men, which is, it's a minority, and it's also special groups. So, so poverty measures today, they overestimate men's individual poverty and underestimates women's poverty. Then there are also some research, which I think is very important, that we should, or maybe we need both, or a shift in focus for the risk of poverty to a risk of dependency. And this would be very much in line with the Swedish economic gender equality policy. Now, I say something about the labor market because that's where it's the basis, the problem of the differences in income between women and men is the labor market, and also at home. It goes together. It's the gender division of labor, simply. Men doing more paid work and women less paid work. And this has to be changed, of course. This shows the employment rate for fathers and mothers with children 0 to 6 years old in Sweden, and men and women 16 to 64 years. And you can see that up until 1990, the development was very different for women and men. For women, it was going up, and for men, it was going down slowly, but very little. But then from 1990, there was this economic crisis in Sweden, and since then, women's and men's employment rate, they follow each other. And they follow the economic cycles, simply. When it comes to economic recession, then, there is one theory that at the onset of, in the start of an economic recession, men tend to lose more than women. And the reason for this is the gender-segregated labor market, where men work in construction and industries, and many women work in the public sector. And the sectors where men work, they are much more influenced by the economic cycles than the public sector, or has been anyway. So if employment in the public sector shelters women in a recession, then women's employment in Sweden and in the Nordic countries could be expected to be relatively secure, since the Nordic countries has the highest share of employees in the public sector of all the OECD countries. And a very big majority of those who work in the public sector are women. And when we looked a bit at this in different EU countries, you can see that the downfall for men comes first, and then women comes afterwards. But then if there is, when it goes up again, then women women might be protected in a recession, but they may be in a disadvantage when it goes up again. And that you can see a bit. And especially then if there is cuts in the public sector, and there is stores in public employment. So a highly segregated labor market, a big public sector, and women's overrepresented in this sector may then turn into a disadvantage. And then I thought maybe we could look a bit at the different Nordic countries, and I compare 2006 and 2016. Denmark was the country that was, if you compare these, I mean, it's difficult to know which years you should use, but if we accept that I compared 2006 and 2016, then Denmark, the employment fell most in Denmark actually, and more for men than for women, with 3.7 percentage points for men, and for women with 3.5 percentage points. The next one, surprisingly, at least for me, was Norway. And there the employment rate for men decreased with 3.3 percentage points, while for women it was the same. In Finland, the men's employment rate decreased with 2.2 percentage point, and here more for women actually, with 2.9 percentage points. And then Iceland, which also I was kind of surprised, because I mean they had a very bad economic crisis in Iceland, but they going back fast. For men, it's more or less the same, the employment rate in 2006 and 2016. For women, it has gone up with 3.3 percentage points. So Iceland is doing...
That is Sweden.
Oh, too bad. Sweden is doing not too bad either. For men, it's about the same. And for women, it has gone up with 2.2 percentage points. No, then Iceland. I don't know. Iceland is recovering, I guess. And especially for women there. For men it's about the same, but for women it's 3.3 percentage points going up. So actually, men in all Nordic countries, now if you compare 2006 and 2016, have lost employment, except in Sweden, where it's more or less the same. Women's employment has decreased in Denmark and Finland, it's about the same in Norway, and increased in Sweden and Iceland. So on the whole then, in the Nordic countries, women's employment has fared better than men's, if we compare these 2 years. The public sector might have something to do with this, the big public sector in the Nordic countries, but according to some investigation, it also has something to do with the shift to services where women work very much in services, but also that the educational level of women is higher in all Nordic countries than men's. So women is doing quite well, not quite well, but they are doing better than men. Anyway. Now, that does not mean, of course, that women's employment rate is higher than men's. If we look at this, but this is also, I mean, it's a very big difference in the employment rate between the Nordic countries, where they are lowest in Finland, 83% for men, and in Iceland it's 93%. It's 10 percentage points higher in Iceland. And also for women in Finland and Iceland there is a big difference. Now, one thing is though, which we might know, that part-time employment is not very common in Finland, but in the other Nordic countries among women, where about a third or something work part-time. Now, part-time, when we measure gender equality, we often use the employment rate. But this is, in Sweden at least, and I think maybe not in the Nordic countries in general, it's not so important anymore. It's the working hours in Sweden that's important. I mean, Swedish-born women's employment rate is higher than foreign-born men's in Sweden. But the working hours among foreign-born men is higher than Swedish-born women. So it's the hours are very important, not the employment rate in Sweden so much anymore. Now, when it comes to part-time unemployment, I think this also has to do with how you define things. When we talk about unemployment, we usually talk about full-time unemployment. But in Sweden, then there were, and we think that women work part-time because they are going to take care of children. And many do. But it's more common that women in Sweden and men work part-time because they can't find more hours. So underemployment or part-time employment is a very, I think, important feminist issue. Because so many more women want to work more hours, and this, of course, influences their incomes. And this shows how the underemployment has developed. And I mean, in the crisis in the beginning of the 1990s, we talked about the unemployment, but that was full-time unemployment. If a person is underemployed, a person is counted as employed if that person works 1 hour. If that same person is unemployed 39 hours, it's not counted. So we have a very, not a very good picture of women's underemployment and unemployment. So this is also in Sweden now. There are many projects about about the right to full-time employment. So, how many? 1 or 2. Okay, then I skip to the next one. Because this is also, I think, interesting. And this is also, I mean, we talk about, at least in Sweden, we have to work more hours, we have to work later up in life. And the big difference between the Nordic countries in how big a proportion of the people between 55 and 64 are employed. And again, and this is interesting because it's actually lower for men in Finland than for women. But in the other countries, it's the women. And this is, again, it has to do with pensions, which is also a very big feminist issue in Sweden and also in other countries. And I think we have to do something about that. I have one more picture. This is about unemployment for people between 25 and 64 years old. And Iceland is hardly any unemployment at all. Finland is quite high. And in Iceland and in Denmark, the unemployment rate is higher for women than for men. But in other countries, it's higher for men than for women. But what I wanted to show also is that I think a feminist approach or a gender perspective on economic policy is very important, but it's far from enough. I mean, women and men are two categories, but within these categories you have big, big differences. And I want to show this one. This is the unemployment rate between native-born and foreign-born men and women in Sweden today. And as you can see, and also age. And you can see if you're young, if you're between 15 and 24, then the unemployment rate is high. But most of these people they are in education of some kind. But if you look at women native born between 25 and 54 in Sweden, it's 2.6. That's also very low employment rate. But if you look at the foreign born in Sweden in the same age group, then the unemployment rate is 14%. So I mean, being foreign born is much worse than being a woman, if you're unemployed. And the same for men, of course. And in all cases, women's unemployment rate is lower than men's. So gender perspective is good, but other things need to be taken care of also. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think our next seminar will be on Finnish men's problems post 55. I'm approaching that age, so. But I think we need a short break now. We have a bit walk and have some water to drink or something, and we take all the questions to the panel debate here after a 5-minute break, and we continue.
Okay, so please, if everybody just take your seats so we can continue with the program. So we have invited here a panel of discussants from different sectors of Finnish society. We have Pauliina Ahokas, who is the managing director at the Tampere Hall, which I learned today is the biggest conference hall in Nordic countries.
Concert, cultural and congress hall.
Yes, welcome. Then we have postdoctoral research fellow Anna Elomäki from the University of Helsinki, chief economist Ilkka Kaukoranta from the Central Organization of Finnish Trade Unions, SAK, and President Mikkel Näkkälä-Järvi, Social Democratic Youth of Finland. Everybody welcome. My name is Maija Mattila. I'm a new project researcher at the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation, and I've been organizing this seminar today. So first I asked you to prepare a short opening statement on the topic, why should we pursue feminist economic policy, and then a visionary statement, how would Finland or any other society with gender-aware economic policy look like? Please, Pauliina.
Okay, to start, very good. Thank you. Pleasure being here. I'm really delighted that you invited me, and thank you very much for the keynotes and presenters before. Well, first of all, I would love to add as to why do I think I have been invited here. It was really brilliant to hear when Anita spoke about Sweden. I have to say that I'm really, really proud and happy that not only our government but also our Prime Minister's office has declared feminist, which means that it's not about this party or whatever the party might be. Because when Finland turned 100, as the installment of the Finland 100 centennial celebrations, Finland decided to start the first international prize that the Finnish Prime Minister's office gives, and that's the International Gender Equality Prize. And I'm really proud and honored to be the chairman of the election prize winner election board, and have been involved in the process. So it's, I think that might be one of the perspectives on this.
Microphone, please.
Okay, yes, I'm trying to speak as closely as possible. Thank you. So, yes, for Finland, this, not only for Finland, but internationally, I personally, and as a country, we believe that this is one of the integral parts, that we really take gender equality forward, because it is a well documented and proven fact that societies that take gender equality seriously are the ones that go forward and prosper the best. Finland, in this perspective, is a remarkable example. 100 years ago, we were one of the poorest countries in the world. In the 40s, we still received international development aid, and now, by any measures, take whatever it's economical, whether it's social, whether it's about well-being, whether it's about ecology, Finland tends to be on the very sort of top of the radars and on top of the index, doing very well. And we know that the one singular factor that takes us to be different in the international context is the fact that, the one singular thing that we know has really affected this, that we were able to rise from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the most prosperous, is the fact that we were the first country in the world to give full political rights to women. So this means not just the ability to be in the workforce, but also be involved in the decision making. This is an incredibly, I still can't believe what a progressive and revolutionary decision this has been a bit over 100 years ago, to be exact. And so for Finland to declare not just a feminist party, one of them or three of them or five of them, or a feminist government, but to really declare that gender equality issues are not, are our cornerstone, not just now, but also in the future, is a very radical decision and a very, I would say, the one singular thing that I believe that is in the core of our future success as well. So this is a topic that I believe very passionately about personally. So this is not my job. I don't get paid for this. In fact, I need to pay quite a bit to be involved in this process. But it's something that I personally believe strongly about. And there are a lot of, I see myself as perhaps in this panel also representing, the private sector, so to speak, a company owned by the city, yes, but 11% of all of our incomes, out of all of our incomes, 11% is by some public money. So we are a private company. But in Finland there's a lot of other entrepreneurs. I can name, very quickly 100 companies in Finland in the core values out of and the core competitiveness somehow is based on their articulated gender equality, not just not just values but measures. A lot has been said about why it is important and what does it all of you spoke so eloquently. Both Zita, Özlem, and Anita spoke really well about why is it useful to invest in it in gender equal economic policy. But yes, in societies with women in the decision making, not just in the workforce but also in the decision making, there's just simply more well-being. It is proven and it's scientifically researched that the most efficient way to stabilize a society and to bring measurable well-being into a society is by having women in its decision-making. And then also, there's also broadly proven facts that companies with well-balanced and/or women in their leadership, they're just simply more efficient. Not necessarily growing the biggest, but they are the most efficient. So, to me, I don't think we need more justification as to why we should pursue it. It's a lot of the decision making in the world at the end of the day, and I can't see how it would be changed, would be forever justified on the measures of economy. So it's let's just then work on those measures and use that articulation and that reasoning. Then, should we already go into how to pursue a feminist policy?
Not yet.
Okay,
I think
so.
we make a first round with the first question. So
Thank you
please,
very much.
Anna.
Thank you. So yeah, about the why should we pursue feminist economic policy? I mainly see two different reasons for it, and the first one is that we have all this research now that points us very clearly that economic policy, when made in a gender-biased or gender-blind way, can have drastic negative effects on gender equality. Just look at all the international research about the effects of austerity on gender equality, and you see this really clearly. And if governments are really committed to promoting gender equality, like they are committed and also obliged through different international treaties, then it's really clear that what follows is that you just can't leave economic policy out of the equation. You need to really bring the gender perspective in it. I mean, gender-blind economic policy can destroy in a moment decades of gender equality work. And the other reason is that that came really well clear in your presentation, that austerity has not been a successful strategy. And there's all this research now that proves us that gender-aware economic policy, it makes economic sense, and that the types of social investments that are really at the core of what many call feminist economic strategy, they create jobs, they increase growth. So it's not only about gender equality being a value as such, but about also it making economic sense. Should I say something about the vision too?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the vision, how I see feminist economic policy or gender-aware economic policy is that it does not only mean that we would somehow do economic policy differently, but what's even more important is that we see and understand economy differently. That we somehow rethink what the economy is and for whom the economy is for. And I give just 2 examples of what this might mean then in practice. So the first point is that if we broaden our understanding of the economy and of the activities seen as economically valuable, what would follow is then that unpaid work and care should be understood as a crucial part of the economy as a whole, and their value, their economic value should also be seen. And the second thing that would kind of have to happen if we would really want to rethink economy is that we have to also rethink the goals of economic policy. So at the moment, the economic policy in Finland, but also elsewhere, it's a lot based on the ideas of competitiveness, reducing public debts, economic growth. But what if we would rethink the goals of economic policy? What if we would actually see that the purpose of economic policy is to support the well-being of people and environment and equality? That would lead to very different outcomes.
Thank you.
Gender equality, I think, is a value in itself. It's like human rights. We don't have to justify it because of its good effects on GDP or economic growth. Even though I'm sure gender equality and human rights do have a positive impact on the economy as well, but that's not the reason why we pursue them. I think it's obvious the policy must not and cannot be gender blind. We have to take into account the effects on the different effects on different genders when doing policy. But at the same time, I think we must not over politicize feminism and gender. I think we need feminist policy, but we can't equate feminist policy with left-wing policy. We can't equate feminist economic policy with anti-austerity policy. I think it's important to see that there are feminists on all sides of the political spectrum, and we have to look for those feminist causes that unite us regardless of party line. I think the debate on parental benefits in Finland is a good example of this, where the political left and political right see it along similar feminist lines, and that sort of attitude we need more of. Over politicizing or alienating the right-wing feminists would be detrimental to the feminist movement in itself.
Thank you, Mikkel.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks also for interesting and impressive presentations. And there were lots of very interesting comparison, especially in Nordic states, and we saw quite straightly that we have some differences and some issues also, especially concerning in structures and labor markets in Finland, especially. But more about that later. So why it's important to pursue feminist politics? It's, well, obviously gender equality is not ready yet, in my opinion, and maybe the 20th century was a time when states, at least in Western societies, developed like things such as civil rights of women, and I guess the 21st century should be definitely the century when economical and social rights and also the cultural aspects of gender equality should be developed even more. Especially, of course, I know most well the Finnish society, and maybe talk in that perspective. But in my opinion, we still have lots of structures which increases inequality and obstructs releasing full potential of people, humankind. And of course, it should be like the great principle of making policy in all political teams that the background of people shouldn't be obstacle on doing things they want to do. And the other question about vision, how Finland should, what kind of feministic economical policy? Well, it's quite wide question, but at least, in my opinion, we should at least have proper, and we should at least make proper estimates on our policies' influence on gender equality. For example, budget and governmental programs and political programs of parties, there isn't proper estimates on how those affects on gender equality. And I guess there is one concrete thing, because you cannot do feministic economic policy if you don't know how your policy is actually affecting on gender equality, for example. And that's why it's very important that, for example, Tasa-arvo, where Anna is from, they are doing very important research on these things, but we also need proper estimates. That's the basic point, in my opinion. But of course, we need also social reforms, and we need to reform our education, and also get take a proper look at our culture in society.
Thank you. By the way, if any of you want to comment on somebody else's point, so just please raise your hand and I will give you floor. Okay, go ahead, Pauliina.
I have an immediate question to Mikkel. You mentioned that there are quite a few different policies that obstruct us from getting into a society or gaining a society that is gender equal. Can you say a couple that you think are the most important?
Well, we have quite strong gender roles in society, in my opinion. That's typical. Well, it comes from schools, our school system, and what kind of things we appreciate on.
Sorry, like I meant, what are the policies? I'm really just genuinely interested. What do you think the policies are behind these?
Well, I don't know. Well, it's about education, so that's maybe a long story, and I don't know if it's like on purpose. I feel it's not maybe on purpose, but it's very not very modern way to think about and it's about educational plans what have been done, but it's also the policies. It's about parental leave system, what Ilkka mentioned about. It's on labor market also, and it's well, our structures of labor market is for example right now they are not promoting gender equality in for example when we negotiate wages of people. The structures are not very good on promoting gender equality. And for example, in Sweden, we have had a discussion about in Finland that should we have some kind of Finnish model on wage policy, and we have took a look to Sweden also, and they have this Swedish model where this. I don't know, export unions sets the limit of making how big wage increases we should make. So that these kind of systems are structural policies which are actually not promoting equality instead of not promoting. But there are some concrete. It's labor markets, wage policies, parental leaves. As we saw in statistics, there are very big differences, and Finland's not doing very well in all sorts of that.
Thank you. I actually wanted to take up the point that Ilkka mentioned that about saying about over-politicizing the gender issue, because I was wondering what especially Professor Onaran was saying here was that that the public sector needs to be, we need to invest in the public sector in order to make the gender equality better. So does it mean that whenever we cut from the public sector, we are actually working for inequality? And this, I think, this also links to the question of whether we need leftist or rightist policies, basically. So, please, would you, Ilkka, reply?
Yeah, I think there is no inherent reason why women should work in the public sector, not in the private sector.
Yes.
It's there is no no need for that sort of division of labor. So I don't think it would be at least in an ideal world, simply growing the public sector should not be the way we increase equality. I think it is possible to have a feminist version of austerity policy. I think it's possible to if you want, you can slim down the government, lower the tax burden, and do it in a way that is gender that takes into account gender. That's possible if you want to do it.
Any other comments, Anna?
Yeah. So exactly, decisions about austerity and cuts, they are always political decisions. There's no necessity that we have to cut exactly there. And one big question is also then the relationship between increasing the tax base and cutting spending. The current government we have in Finland made the very political decision to only cut spending as an adjustment. So the government decided to keep the tax base as it is. And the previous government we had made a very different decision. They decided that if adjustments in the public finances are needed, half is going to be made through tax increases and half through cuts. And that's already a big question from a gender perspective. Do we cut public spending or do we increase the income? For example, exactly through increasing capital tax or through some other means. And then even when cutting is for some reason necessary, then you still have a lot of options in terms of where to cut. It doesn't have to be childcare first. In particular, when the amounts of savings made through cutting childcare are actually really small in comparison to the overall cuts.
Thank you. And Pauliina?
Well, it's I wouldn't like to think that only one type of policy making can own gender equality. I simply can't believe in that. In that case, half the countries in the world wouldn't have any hope. So I can't believe in that. I'm sorry. So therefore, the question of how to pursue feminist economic policy, I completely agree with Mikkel that first of all, we have to have really concrete measures as to any decision. How does it affect? What is its effect in terms of gender equality? This can be done. You work with tasa-arvo,
yeah.
Yes. And there's incredible. You just had a seminar today.
Yes, I can tell.
About you have concrete. You've developed incredible. Concrete measurement systems as to any policy, what is its gender implications. Let's take a very concrete big thing currently in Finland. Sote, I don't know what sote might be in English, but it's we're completely renewing our communal
social and healthcare system reform.
Healthcare system and how it's reorganized and organized. What are the different sizes of the units that make the decisions and that type of things. And it's one of the biggest reforms in the history of Finland. And we haven't measured as a country and as decision makers. We haven't measured what are its gender implications. We know that 15% of women will most probably change their employer, and that's a lot. And we also know that most of these companies are run by women, that they will be most likely becoming employed by, which is quite, these are two things that are quite interesting. But we as a country, we have to pursue that, any decision that will be made will be first, before it's implemented, will be measured by its gender implications. We have to do it, because we know that this is an integral part of our competitiveness, and we have to also show a model that, this is the way that we go forward as a country. And then, so, you are a better professional to speak about these measures. But I have to say that how a feminist economic policy is, really is received. I believe in, targeting a few things. Not trying to solve the whole world. I look at party programs in Finland. I'm not, I'm not declared to a party in Finland. I'm a very, in many ways a political person at the same time as I'm a very political person. So I look at party programs. In fact, during the seminar beginning, I received messages from 3 party secretaries because I made the question for them: what is the core of their party, their feminist policy? And the difficulty is that we always try and solve so many things. Any party in Finland and any government in Finland tends to have 168 different things to be changed. And we are a country that believes that if we take small steps to the better, we make it, and that is in a way the core of our competitiveness. That we've taken smaller, careful steps for the better. But in terms of gender equality, it's things are not moving forward. They haven't really moved forward in Finland for a long, long time, and therefore I really, really call for a more ambitious policy in terms of gender equality. And the one thing that I believe passionately about is parental care, parental leave policy. It is in the core of our problems, I believe, in many ways, because I see it happening in this society. It's women stay at home to take care of the children. The numbers are just horrific in that sense. And what it brings is that the families learn the fact that the woman takes care of the food, nurturing the baby, nurturing the house, and doing the housework. And when we re-enter the workforce, that's the way. Very few of us have the power to do the same battle as I did to really change that system. Most of us in Finland still are the first nurturers of the family, of the house, of the kids, and da-da-da. And therefore, you just don't have the stamina to really go and do a proper, take your role in the workforce and in the decision making and in the challenging positions. And it's and there's a million reasonings for this, but I personally believe that this is something that we just really have to take care of, have to change it, and just go with more ambitious measures than most of the parties are just talking about. Let's add the daddy leave by 2 weeks. Like what? Sorry, nothing is going to happen with the 2 weeks. It has to be a more ambitious action.
So what would be more ambitious? What would be ambitious enough?
Nobody has shown me a better model than 666. Just basically, if there is, and this model doesn't apply and it works for any family model. Most people say that, what if there isn't a daddy? Just look into the model. It does work, even if there is like 2 mothers or just 1 mother or whatever. But it's just taking into account that there usually is, a biological case into having a child, which is, a man and a woman, whether it's even artificial insemination. So it's, really dividing the responsibility. And that really, it makes a change in this society.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. Just a comment on the parental leave first, and then I will go back to the gender impact assessment issue. So I agree that the 6+6+6 model is the best one if you add some flexibility and do
Could you please define the 6+6+6?
That you would actually increase the length of the paid parental leave up to 18 months. Now it's somewhere, Ilkka knows the best probably, but somewhere 12, 13
About
months.
10,
10,
11.
Yeah. so that you could actually have a quota for both parents of proper length, so quota of 6 months for the father, quota for 6 months for the mother or for any parents,
for the other
parent, and then the last 6 months would then be left to divide between the parents as they want. But the problem now is that because economy and the idea that we need to be really careful with public finances has become to determine the public debate about parental leave a lot. Now there's quite a broad consensus in different political parties that, well, you know, we can do a proper parental leave reform in a cost-neutral way, which means that this 6+6+6 model that would actually really require additional investment because you are then increasing the paid part of the leave is a bit, it's not as popular anymore as it used to be.
6+6 then.
Yeah. But but about the gender impact assessment, so as Mikkel said, it's extremely important that we would, whatever types of decisions about the economy we make, we would do them knowing what follows and who's impacted. And to this end, it's crucial that we are able to assess the gender impacts of whatever policies we are planning to propose or the budgets. And this just is not happening at the moment in Finland, and there are different reasons for it. And one of them is that we really don't have enough people at the moment with skills and interests to do this type of gender analysis that would actually require using microeconomic modeling and macro modeling and so forth. It's very difficult work, and we have not yet in Finland really developed the methodologies in the same way that in the UK Women's Budget Group has done, for example. And now the Ministry of Finance just put out on Friday a call for proposals where they are proposing to give 150,000 euros for a group of researchers who would actually develop these models.
Okay, wow.
It's very little money actually to do. This is a huge job, but it's a start. And I find it a positive step that there is actually public funding for this purpose, and there seems to be an understanding in the Ministry of Finance and in the government administration that this is a problem that we don't know the gender impacts, and there is willingness to develop gender budgeting and to develop gender analysis. That's all great. But the big question is then that even if we would have all the knowledge about the possible gender impacts of specific policies, would this knowledge actually matter? And that's then where different political ideologies and values come into play. So even if we had the knowledge, it might not necessarily be taken into account if it goes against certain type of political or value conservative goals. And we see this really well with the parental leave reform debate at the moment. So there's all this great research produced by Ilkka and others about, let's say, the positive employment effects of reforming our parental leave system. But this data, this very hard data, seems to have no influence because there are political parties that are very value conservative in the government who block the reform and just neglect all the research data we have.
Thank you, Ilkka.
I think on the parental leave system, it's I think it's possible to have a feminist view and consider that the home care allowance that we do have that promotes long stay-at-home mothers. You can see it from a feminist perspective as a positive thing. It gives money, but the money is primarily targeted towards women. And you can see it as a positive thing in that sense. But its effect on female employment is entirely different. So yeah. I think from a gender perspective, whether you look at the gender budgeting simply at who ends up with the money, you end up at a different result than if you look at the dynamic effects and how it affects employment and all of that. And I think it's important to recognize that even from a feminist perspective, you can arrive at a different policy choices depending on what you value most. So it's even if you take a feminist perspective, it's not there is not one single right answer. And I think the discussion about parental benefits and the 6+6+6 model is a sign that where we talk about these reforms but do not implement them. And I think that it shows that for a certain type of reform there is political will to talk about it, and you want to brand yourself as a feminist that supports 666 or other very, very generous policies. But at the end of the day, in an actual budget meeting, the government, as the politician responsible for the budget, you don't want to find the 600 million euros to implement that policy. So there's a disconnect between what you actually want to do when you have to make the decision and what you say you would like to do. So I think forcing politicians to make actual choices, value choices, is important. And in that sense, the discussion with cost-neutral reforms, I think, is a step in the right direction, because it forces politicians to take a value judgment, whether using the money we currently have, would you like to use it in the current way or in a way that promotes female employment. And that's a much tougher choice than supporting a model that costs far more.
Thank you. Will Mikkel, would you like to comment or?
Oh, very briefly. Well, I try to be brief at least. It's not very easy to politicians often, I know, but I have been thinking just same as Anna mentioned before, that even though we would have all the information, I'm not very confident either that there will be like reform strong enough, because well, I don't know. Well, this is a very good example about that we have lots of knowledge that supports some kind of policies, but still it's like in Finland especially we have totally different election system than in, for example, in Sweden and in Denmark. We don't have these coalitions, and those parties always negotiate with all the parties, not just a couple of ones, which actually makes the decision, makes the politics on very like well, all the parties have 100 goals, and voter actually don't have any idea before election that what are the priorities of the party, because there are lots of goals and you cannot know what are in the top of the list, and that's a problem, because then you very often in Finnish politics it's foreign politics and economical politics which are dominating the whole discussion of politics, and you cannot find that much political parties and politics who are like strong enough to make reforms which actually have in very high priority, for example, some kind of social politics sectors, and everything are compromises. So what I'm basically trying to say, it's like if you have one reform you want to do, you need a couple of people who really strongly are willing to force it down, because if you don't have any owner of your great idea, you just need one party or one strong politicians to block this. And this is a very good example, this parental leave system right now, because well, I must say that there are three parties in government, and one of them, Kokoomus, they were like kindly quite positive about making reform, but in the same time there was one party, this Finnish party, which were strongly opposing, and Kokoomus didn't had that much will on making reform, so they dropped them down. So we have basically, I believe that, for example, Ilkka has made a model model about parental leave system which costs zero, like basically. I guess that if that model would go to Parliament, it would pass. It would pass there, but it's not going to Parliament because government are not going to make proposal on it.
Can you tell us, Ilkka, what it is? Sorry.
Well, quite briefly, it's a cost-neutral way of using the current money. It makes it more flexible, so you can use the benefits in a shorter period rather than the current 3 years. And it has 13 months of earnings-related family benefits, and then 6 months of basic level, and it has a three-month quota for both genders, or both parents. So that increases the father's quota in Finland from about 2 months to 3 months. So it has a gender aspect in that sense.
But what do you think, Ilkka, that would that kind of reform have a majority in Parliament? If
we look at the proposals from different parties, Social Democrats and the Green Party, the Swedish, what are they called? Swedish yeah.
People's Party.
People's Party, yeah. And Kokoomus, yes. It's very broad agreement that we need a reform in that sort of direction. But as you said, yeah, the way the coalition governments work is that all parties have a veto, and
yes.
And since we always, well, so far we've had coalitions with parties where someone wants to have the veto on this.
So now we are going quite deeply into the Finnish political system, but maybe if I would let our keynote speakers to comment at this point, if you would like, do you have any comments so far for the panel discussion, or I can also give you the floor at the end of the panel if you would like to comment on these discussions that we are having right now. Nothing right now.
No, just say one
I will give you a microphone, just a moment.
The cost neutrality. I mean, I'm suffering from lack of economic literacy in party politics when they talk about cost neutrality in particular. It's so static. When you give that money to households, it's immediately a cost, of course, but households will do things with this money. And probably, even in the very short run, there will be some return of that to the economy and some self-financing. But I think for me, most importantly, how that money is spent today will have tremendous effects in the next 20 years in the development of that society. This is the idea of going forward. And I am deliberately instrumentalizing gender equality here because in the long run, it creates a better infrastructure for businesses too. It creates a better society, more equal society, but also a better infrastructure, I suppose, for children's development. That will mean a very different thing. If a child is brought up equally by both parents, the cost of that statically today maybe X, but that will so much return back to the community in the 20 years. This is why we need to have models that look into the 20 years if we are talking about state. I'm not talking about here a private equity funded businesses short-term 1-year profitability plan. No offense to private equity funds, but obviously they are known for short-termism, isn't it? So this sort of cost neutrality, if you are interested in costs, please let's look at it in 20 years at least, not in 1 year. We can afford more than that in Europe.
So do you think that politicians in Finland think too short-sightedly and not enough long-term in a long-term way? Anna, please.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, whenever a big social reform is being discussed, like the parental leave reform or another debate we had some time ago that was about free childcare, then immediately somebody puts the immediate costs at the table. You know, free childcare would cost municipalities so many hundred millions of euros. Oh, you know, the 6+6+6 model for parental leave too costly, we can find the 600 millions, but then we don't really, or it seems to me that we don't have the people who would actually provide the kind of more long-term perspective to this. So it's not the people within the ministries who would provide this kind of research. In the research community, we do not, unfortunately, at the moment, have that many people in Finland who would be able to provide this kind of research either, or who would have funding for this kind of research. So it would be tremendously important to have this kind of data, as well as to have the kind of research that you just presented in terms of the new policy mixes and alternatives, but we just don't have the people and the resources at the moment to produce that.
Yeah, Pauliina, please.
Yeah, I would like to say here, like completely supporting that. Like I said, in my opening statement, is that it's we just have to face it as a fact. I believe that most decisions in this world will be based somehow on the basis of economy. Now, I worked in the arts and culture for quite a few years, and I've taken as granted that I have to speak the language of economy. So I've always, the past 15 years, I've really spent a lot of time, most of my time, really looking for numbers and really looking for the economical research behind the cases. And I have to say, I've been really lucky and happy to be really successful with it, to really, be able to bring the numbers. So it's, we've discussed this with, for example, Naisasialiitto Unioni today and tasa-arvoneuvottelukunta, tasa-arvoasiainneuvottelukunta, and then the Organization of Finnish Feminist Movements, Naisten järjestöjen keskusliitto, that one concrete thing we have to take forward is basically, support gender studies in the economies departments, in the, to really bring the numbers and to really bring the reasoning from that point of view.
Ilkka, would you like to comment on the cost neutrality or something else?
Yes. I think it's definitely important to take the long-term view also and do the full analysis, but at the same time it's we must be credible with our numbers and not jump to the conclusion that any social investment pays for itself. All social investments are the same.
Yes.
It's obviously different whether we invest more in maternity benefits or paternity benefits, home care allowance or the earnings-related parental benefits, or cheap free daycare. Within the same sector of family policy, you can do vastly different things with money, and not all of these would have the same impact, and I don't think all of them would have a positive impact. And it's important to look for the numbers, do the full math, but not simply pretend that all social investment is beneficial simply because it is social.
From different value perspectives, you can always reason any action to be beneficial in the future in terms of the economy.
Yeah, especially when you don't do the math and you simply make a story about it. So.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time for us to open the floor for audience questions. There we have one. Would somebody please take the mic there?
Thanks a lot. I'm Thomas Wahlgren. I'm from here. And I'm an owner that you're looking for in politics. I'm recently elected to City Council in Helsinki. And I would like to invite you to propose at the spot your concrete proposals for eco-feminist progress in Helsinki in the next 4 years. The City Council will produce during the next 4 months a new strategy for the next 4 years for Helsinki. So Helsinki struggles to be the leading champion of eco-feminist politics in the world. So in that perspective, what are the sensational contributions you want to make to our strategizing? And those ideas which you can't present at the moment because of time doesn't allow, or ideas are not fresh enough, please come next Monday, 29th May, to Vallilan Kirjasto for cross-party political strategizing. We're inviting from the city council different parties with activists with profound, deeply changing ideas, so we can make Helsinki a champion of these things. Ecofeminist perspectives and contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any ideas?
Yeah, definitely. One idea would be to build more city, more dense city that is conducive to public transport. Take the current motorways coming to the city and change them to normal streets and build houses for 100,000 people there. A city that is conducive to public transport is an equal city, and I think there's that sort of equality aspect also. And
that will happen anyway.
Well, yeah. I am not quite convinced that those 100,000
not without really serious land planning. Yeah.
Okay, other ideas? Mikkel?
Oh, well, we have been already discussing about children daycare. That's important, that don't raise costs too much and don't well, I don't know how can it take. So, well, all the kids should have access to daycare. But it's also one very concrete. It's about when you. I don't know if it's already have tried in Helsinki, but when people are seeking jobs, I guess this should be anonymized. This job seeking progress, and I am very happy and proud of saying that we have already anonymized in our organization, and that has been working quite good in my opinion.
Thank you, Anna.
Introduce gender budgeting. I think somebody has already made in the city council the proposal, and then you could look at other cities in Europe who are already further with it, like Berlin, let's say, organize a seminar, invite people from Berlin to come over and tell how they are doing, and then learn and go forward.
Can I have a comment on that?
Yes, please. Just wait for the microphone, please. Mikko is bringing it.
Elizabeth Halanna in the Sorsa Foundation board. Just a very brief comment. I was so envious when Anita Nyberg was explaining that the Swedish government for each budget proposal puts an annex on the gender impact. Why can't Helsinki do the same? I thought that was a brilliant idea, because that forces everyone to think about it, and it also creates a debate. So I thought that was a brilliant proposal.
Thank you. And then comment from Anita Nyberg.
Yeah, I would, when it comes to the municipalities, what you should look at, I think, at least my experience from Sweden, is that you should look at how much money and resources you spend on male sports.
On what? Sorry? On what?
Male sports.
Yeah.
And the police protection around.
Thank you. And one more comment from the audience.
Yes, I'm Sakarian, and I'm a political scientist, but I'm not talking about that. Only a comment that it would be really interesting to analyze. One of our real interest has been this kind of rhetorical analysis, and the idea now that different parties are exclaiming to be feminist, what kind of rhetoric is involved in it, and how it's being used. But where I really want to come into is what Anita Nyberg was telling. One thing was that you said, as far as the feminist agenda kind of is concerned, feminist economic agenda, that there should be kind of right to full-time work, but possibility for part-time work. That was kind of like the combination, which is kind of interesting. I mean, like if we compare, for instance, the Nordic countries, what really explains also why the employment rate in Finland is much lower is because the part-time, women's part-time work is much less developed. But my point is that in more pragmatic terms, one could say that there could be kind of like right to part-time work and the possibility of full-time work. And this kind of reversal is interesting to make. And it really connects with the precarization discourse. I'm a little bit surprised that when you have been talking, there has been no mention about the kind of like what's going on in the labor markets and the precarization and the part-time. For instance, some of these precarity discuss, I mean like the researchers want to include part-time work as kind of defining precarity. It certainly can't, I think. And my point to make is that could you a little bit explain what kind of discussions around, or has there been Sweden discussions around this kind of like possibility of part-time work or right to full-time? Because as I know, well, we published for Palgrave a book on precarization. And what I noticed was that there are intense discussions in Britain, in Germany, in other countries between kind of like labor market researchers and these pointing out on the precarization. And now we come to these divisions. Of course, it's the case that I certainly agree that taking the gender issue would also broaden and make what we understand economy to be a kind of a quite revolutionary idea. But that's one basic division. Actually, when we are doing such a thing, we are introducing that there is no such things as consumer as such, or homo economics as such, or producer as such, but we could introduce any kinds of divisions. And now there are also, in this sense, there are divisions between in the position of women in labor market and how this is taken into.
So your question is to Anita Nyberg if there is discussion in Sweden about this precarization of work, and the question of precarization of work and the question of part-time, full-time work.
And especially of the idea of right to full-time work versus possibility of part-time. Why not the other way around?
Small questions here in the end.
I mean, when women in Sweden entered the labor market in the 60s and 70s, then the norm was the male norm. You should work full-time. But since there was no childcare, or very little childcare, and parental and maternity leave was very short, so women, and there was a big demand for women's work in Sweden at that time. So then eventually it became a lot of part-time work, and that worked for that time. But it doesn't work anymore. And there is also the right for parents to shorten their working time. So there is a right for shorter working time. But now the problem is mainly that. But mainly now the problem is that people can't get enough hours. So there have been, I think, at least 3 different investigations trying to change this with law. But also since the social partners are strong in Sweden, and they have a lot to say about working time. So I would say that the only effective time when men's working time was shortened was when working time in general was shortened, from 47 to 45 to 40 hours. Then men's working time was shortened. But women's was also, in spite of the fact that women work part-time.
Thank you very much. I think we have to wrap it up, but I will still very quickly give floor to our panelists here, just in 2 sentences. What is the biggest obstacle in Finland against the gender equality, and what should be done about it? Just very, very quickly, please. It's a big question, but I'm looking for simple solutions.
Well, maybe still the biggest issue is lack of knowledge. When we discuss about equality and gender of equality, it's very superficial. The level, it's not very deep level how we discuss about gender equality. That we have lots of people in Finland actually thinking that because the law says that people are equal and have same rights. Many people are understanding that equality successing very well right now. So Well, at least we need more research and more discussion and different kind of estimations and well, I guess that we also need a political will and also time.
Thank you. Ilkka?
Rather than problems and obstacles, I would rather focus on the positives, and I think this growing discussion about feminist economic policy in Finland is a very positive thing. And also looking at government policy, when this government started, in the government program was cuts to children's daycare and increasing fees. And what they now ended up doing is quite the opposite. They're now adding funds and decreasing fees. So I see that there is growing political momentum in the right direction, and this is from both sides of the political spectrum, and this is something we should also stop to applaud at times.
Optimist.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. And to continue about this momentum, I think it's also true that something has changed in the past couple of years. We have had, I think that a few years ago you wouldn't have heard anyone in public to put the words feminism and economic policy in the same sentence. And now we are here in this seminar, and the main newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, has been writing about feminist economic policy, and it has become somehow much more common to talk about the economy from a feminist perspective, and this is a great start. But then we need to continue pushing, because the pressure to make the political will appear, or to at least remind politicians of the need to act, it has to come from somewhere. And where does it come from? Well, you know, it can come from the research community, it can come from the trade unions, it can come from the members of parliament. At the municipal level, we also need actors, so the business community. So I think that it's really a question of how do we want to use this momentum and not let it just disappear.
Thank you, and Pauliina.
Yes, I would like to add to this wonderful question that the gentleman made about how to really pursue this. I think it's about all of us taking the responsibility of putting pressure on our decision makers, whether it's bureaucrats or politicians, to really keep the issues. I have to agree that I'm really delighted how feminism somehow has been rebranded in Finland, and I think, and I see across Europe in many ways, that it's actually something really positive to strive for. And therefore, I will also, it's IGEP, International Gender Equality Prize, is one of these means. This country, this government, if we keep this thing on the map, that we as a country have, really dedicated into this, on the international field, we have decided to really go forward with this particular issue. If we just keep it forward, so, therefore, as a concrete action, I just go 10 days to leave your submission as to who should be the winner. Do it, to show that, there are people in this country and internationally who are interested in this subject.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank, on behalf of the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation, our keynote speakers, Anita Nyberg and Özlem Onaran. I'd like to thank Miha Javornik for coming from Slovenia, or did she fly from Brussels or Slovenia, coming all the way to here. Our panelists, thank you very much. Our audience, have a great evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
On tuossa oikeasti nyt käännettä parempaan.